सदाकते इस्लाम कुछ भी हो जाएंगे हम जहाँ भी के जाना पड़े हमें जाएंगे हम जहाँ भी के जाना पड़े हमें.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to another live episode of Beacon of Truth. This program explores a variety of contemporary issues relevant to today's young Muslims. And to help analyze these subjects, we get the views and expertise of some guests, as well as the general public. And since this is a live and interactive show, you too can get in touch with any comments or questions via our Twitter handle, which is @beacon_MTA, or via email, the address of which is beacon@mta.tv. This series has explored questions on God and developing certainty of His existence. We have looked at how Islam is relevant to today's world and analyzed if religion is what introduced morality to mankind. But despite religion having spread in the world, peace has not been established. Conflicts between individuals, social groups, and even nations occur all the time, and unfortunately, this could be called quite normal. The fact that the human race is a complex species means that the causes of conflict are just as complex. The reasons could range from personality differences or a clash of emotional needs, or maybe one side commits an injustice against another. Whatever the reasons, someone suffers harm as a result. But it is a common perception among many people that religion does more harm than good, that it divides people and is the cause of conflict and war. In recent times, we have seen groups like the IRA, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS who all use religion to justify their actions. We also see major sectarian conflicts across the world. Historically, European Catholics fought long and bloody wars against Protestants, and more recently, we are seeing Sunni nations follow an aggressive policy against Shia countries and vice versa. When such conflicts are presented as though they are religiously motivated, then can we really argue that religion is not a cause of conflict? To explore such questions in greater depth, today in the studio, I am joined by Imam Shahzad Ahmed Sahib and Imam Zafir Malik Sahib, both of whom are Imams and scholars of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Assalamu alaikum, gentlemen, and welcome to the show. So, during the introduction, I mentioned that people believe that religion is the cause of conflicts. Can, Shahzad Sahib, perhaps you can begin and tell us that why do you think people have this perception? Why do they believe this?
Jazakallah, Usman Sahib. Religion has been and is a source of great comfort and peace and a means of establishing a relationship and communion with the divine, and has been so for many years throughout history for billions of people around the world. So it's most unfortunate that in nowadays, and particularly in recent times, that increasingly religion is being associated with violence and hatred and conflict, as you also mentioned in your introduction. Now, if we speak from, say, a strictly Islamic perspective, we see that in the last 100 years or so, we see a very wild and a dangerous interpretation of the Holy Quran has come about and has been promoted amongst certain sections of Muslims. And if we look at the core of it, into the depth of it, we find that actually there is a lot of vested interests in there, which are actually spurred and inspired by political and financial and geopolitical reasons. And all this violence and hatred is carried out and is played out in the guise of religion and faith. And that is the most sort of a great injustice to faith.
So there's a lot of other issues, but then religion is being used.
There are many, yes, of course, there are many deeper implications, and sometimes religion is made a scapegoat. It's easy to sort of wrap these hateful acts in scripture and get away with it. Right. And equally to brainwash and influence young minds, yes, and get them to carry out the actions that you want to. So religion has been used and misused and exploited in this way And so we see that increasingly people have now, unfortunately, started to associate religion with conflict and violence. But if we go to the pristine teachings of religion, and particularly Islam, we find that religion actually is a great source of comfort, peace, and as I said, of a means of establishing communion with the divine.
I mean, I guess people really need something quite strong in order to justify carrying out certain actions.
Absolutely.
They need to convince themselves, first of all, before they convince others.
Yeah, I mean, to take your own life, I mean, there needs to be something to inspire you, right?
Yes.
To take your own life, and we see that some of the the sort of promises that they give them are what they're going to achieve in the hereafter and what they're going to attain, and sort of young minds who are frustrated, who have no future, nothing, they latch onto them.
Yes.
If you look at these people who carry out these atrocities, who travel across to these areas and carry out these attacks, and if you look at their background and do a sort of background check on, you'll find almost in every single one of these cases, you'll find that they were those vulnerable people within society
Yes.
who were lacking any kind of direction, any kind of guidance, and they were tapped by these people, and by giving this sort of ideology, in some way they inspired them.
Right.
And
There
send
were
them
religious
over.
novices as well. They didn't really have
Absolutely.
any. In most
yeah.
cases that I've seen, the cases that have been in the media,
Yeah.
that's how it's
I mean,
come
in
out.
one case, they said that the person that went over to Syria to fight, he had downloaded a book from, I think, Amazon, which said Islam for Dummies, or the Holy
Yes,
Quran
there was
for
two of
Dummies.
them who downloaded.
So-
Even if the journalist who went over into ISIS when they were at their peak,
Yes.
and he asked the common soldiers, show him a copy of the Quran, they couldn't produce a
didn't
copy
have
of the
it.
Quran.
It wasn't
They
a
had no
priority
idea.
for them, it seems.
Exactly.
Right. And so what is the role of the media in this whole issue? Does that play a role?
I think, as Shazad have also touched on this, the media plays a key role in all this. And in fact, if we look at in recent times, Islam has come in the media more often, and it's been portrayed in a way that it's any attack in which there is a Muslim involved automatically is labelled as a terrorist attack.
Right.
We can mention
Yeah.
so many examples in the US, in the UK, Belgium, France, attacks in Europe, all over the world. In
They
fact,
seem to have reserved certain phrases specifically for Muslim
exactly.
perpetrators.
Let me
of
give you a
crimes.
small example,
Yeah.
Usman Saab. In San Bernardino, when a young Muslim couple unfortunately killed approximately 9 people
In the USA.
in the USA, it was labelled as one of the worst terrorist attacks since 9/11. In the media, it was all over in different outlets. Whereas, a few months ago, we know in Las Vegas, a gunman shot and killed approximately over 70 people in cold blood, and there was a whole debate in the news whether he was even a terrorist or not.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
that just shows what how the media can play a role in this.
Yes.
And in fact, depending on Usman Sahib, we know as part of being Ahmadis, every year 30,000 Muslims gather in one place
Yes.
in a small area, and we hold our conventions peacefully. When does that ever get documented?
Yes.
The fact is, the media need to sell stories, and to sell stories, you need certain type
You
of
need
stories.
to catch something to catch the
That's
hook
it.
of the viewer. But I think it's also a fact that the Holy Scriptures, they do make mention of violence and war, as well as all the other aspects of peace and justice and so on. So why do the Holy Scriptures make even a mention of that?
Usman Sahib, it's part of human nature, conflict, and we know since, if we look at history, that there's been conflict irrespective of religion. People have fought over various issues, as Shazad Sahib also mentioned, due to land, just due to economic reasons. So, if Islam in particular, let me talk about the Holy Quran.
Yes.
There are verses in the Quran which refer to war, which refer to how Muslims should deal with themselves in war, in times of war. Now, we claim that the Quran and Islam is a universal teaching. We know for a fact in history that conflict is a unfortunate part of life.
Yes.
So if Islam didn't deal with that aspect, how would Muslims know how to conduct
behave.
themselves?
Yeah.
Exactly. And
Right.
if we look at the teachings in the Quran as well, there's over 6,000 verses. The majority of them speak about the rights towards fellow mankind,
Yes.
the rights that man has towards God, worship, etc., how they should, pay their charity, etc.,
Yes.
etc. All these fundamental injunctions and how one should lead their life are mentioned. Only a handful of verses refer to war, and even those they have context,
Yes.
specific context, in which God Almighty deals with a certain part, or in fact God Almighty states that when you do go to war, you should do certain things. For example, let me give you the first verse that was revealed about war, in fact, was that permission has been granted to those on whom war has been waged.
Okay, so it's defensive.
So that sets the precedent of what Islamic wars are about, or why Muslims had to fight in history.
Right.
And even the verses of the Holy Quran that Zafar Sahib is alluding to, if you look and ponder over each and every one of them, you find that the underlying spirit and principle behind these is the establishment of peace and justice.
Yes.
So if, as a last resort, physical intervention is needed, it's only there to establish peace and justice.
Right.
So that's also something that needs to be understood.
Right. And if it was missing, I guess,
verses.
if these teachings were missing, then there would be an accusation would come that
there would be an allegation on Islam
incomplete.
saying that it's not a universal religion. How can it be a universal religion when it doesn't deal with such a crucial topic?
Yeah.
And Usman Sahib, just as Shahzad mentioned, we see that even take religion out of the question, the European powers and the major powers have intervened in certain countries when they felt the need to establish peace or whatever the reasons were. They have intervened. Yep. So that's exactly what the Quran talks about when there's...
And they have rules of war and rules of engagement.
Exactly.
But the
Usman said the rules of war mentioned by the Holy Prophet ﷺ were so stringent that, in fact, because there's always an allegation that Islam was spread by the sword, etc. We've heard it countless of times. But the Holy Prophet ﷺ, before he sent every general, he would tell them that you are only to fight those who have come to fight you in the battlefield. No women are to be touched, no children to be touched, no elderly, no religious figures, no religious buildings are to be destroyed. That's religious buildings, I'm not talking about mosques. We're talking about other religious buildings.
So very specific rules were put in place for that.
Putting aside human values, the Holy Prophet ﷺ stressed this so much that he said, don't cut a tree unnecessarily on the journey to battle. I mean, look how much Islam emphasizes on protecting the environment.
Yes. Okay, great. So that's very interesting. We've also gone out to the general public as well. So we went out and asked the same question that we're addressing today: does religion cause conflict? So let's turn to that now and hear the views of the public.
It might be like that, yeah. It's hard to say because we didn't have a world without religion, so it's just hypothesis, everything. So, yeah, but it could be, yeah. Yeah, all the world have been fighting, yeah. And it's all been about religion. Not always, but many times. But it's hard to say.
Well, I think to take an example, if the Islamic and Christian religions are practiced as taught, as preached in the various holy books, then there would be no conflict. But people are human, and therefore there's conflict. So I would say it's humans who bring about discord within religion, and not the religions or their doctrines themselves.
I guess factually, if you look at it, I suppose there has been a lot of conflicts that come down to religion, but I guess because religion's such an important part of people's lives, that's something that people would fight over. So, but people have had wars over, politics and like personal disputes and things like that. So it's not just really. I think religion has caused conflict and will continue to do so. But it's not, obviously, its fault for being religion. Lots of things have caused conflicts, and it's just because people feel so strongly about something, and people feel so strongly about something else, that will cause conflict. So it's not just like religion that will do that, things like political views and things like that.
Well, it's one of the causes for the problems that we have, but it's not the main cause. It's like just a tool that anyone can use just to justify like bad things.
I think that's a twisting of mankind in some ways, in the sense of, if you look at, I'm not an expert on every religion, but if you look at most religions, at their heart talks of cooperation with fellow man, loving one another, living in a peaceful society. So I don't think, my view certainly wouldn't be that religion is the cause of conflict. Is rather the conflict comes from man on man or person on person not being able to coexist.
I guess many of them are, but I mean, I don't know, because in the end, things like greed, it doesn't have to do anything with religion per se. and there are vices which transcend any particular religion. So I'm not sure whether like majority of conflicts are due to religion. Some of them are, and I think in some of them religion appears to be the cause superficially, but maybe there are other things at play deep down.
Oh, I think there's good and bad in every religion, and I think that because of the badness seems to take the publicity seems to focus on the badness in religions, but I think that 99% of people actually want to do good, but being good isn't really newsworthy, so we only see the bad. And I think that 95 or 99% of people would quite happily coexist with each other and accept each other's differences, and that's the way that it should be. And I also think that there's a lot of bad, and if we allow the bad to divide us, the bad has won.
I agree to a certain extent. I don't hold a view that's strong enough to suggest that I support that's definitely the case. But I do see from the media and from the way in which things are reported that religion and difference of opinion certainly seems to generate quite a lot of friction that can then tend to lead to violence and some of the problems that we experience today, you know, in terms of terrorism and in terms of war and those sorts of things. But I think it's a lot more complicated than just being associated with religion would be my suggestion.
No, I don't think so. I think the most conflict were caused by other causes, probably need to expand, go to new territories, proto-economics, I would say, things. And I think that sometimes they have been not masqueraded as a religion conflict, but I think that religion is not the main issue. It can help sometimes, unfortunately, to divide people, but it becomes like a flag. It's not. I don't think it's the basis of real conflict, in my opinion.
Religion just made us do everything, you know, like when massive cathedrals are built, everywhere else is mud hut, like not mud huts, but just basic. But religion made us build these massive monuments in that time, and so of course it drives us just to kill each other, do all that kind of stuff, just to put your own views ahead, you know.
I think it's just human nature in a way. I mean, we like disagreeing with someone who doesn't have the same point of view as we do. So just because you have a different belief, you can end up fighting with, regardless. I might like the color purple and you like the color green, and I might hate you because of that. And I think you should not like green and want to get rid of all green. It's the exact same idea. It's just not liking someone because they're not part of what you believe in. Yeah?
Like I said, there is good, there is bad. I think that without religion there may have been less wars in that period, but at the same time...
Jesus loves you. Jesus loves you.
And apparently Jesus loves me, so that's a better way to end it than that, to be fair.
Okay, so that was quite interesting, those views from the public. So, I mean, we've had views quite philosophical in their point of view as well. It seems that they're not all blaming religion, as it were. But, you know, some of the comments were like, if they practiced what they preach, then there would be no conflict. You know, but also that because it's something quite important to people, then people, you know, may fight over it. So, but also one person said that
the ending was summarized and was perfect.
Yes,
Jesus loves you. And in fact, that is the core and fundamental teaching of every prophet and every religion, which is based on love, harmony, peace, and tolerance.
Yes.
And that's what every religion at its, you know, the pristine teachings of every religion, if they're studied, that is what they reflect.
Yes.
And establish. And in fact, I mean, some of them mention that perhaps they disagreed with us and said that religion is the cause of many of the conflicts and violence that we see around us. But, you know, there's some, if we study the facts and figures on this, it's actually completely the opposite of this. You know, a very in-depth and extensive study was carried out, I think, as recently as 2008. I think it was the encyclopedia of all the wars that have happened so far. And they've gone through... absolutely. A very extensive research that was done. And I think there was over 1,700 odd wars that they had studied and found that I think about 120 or 123 of those wars were religious in nature.
Yes.
That's just less than 7% 7% of wars which are religious in nature, 93% of these wars had nothing to do with religion.
Right.
They were other factors, as we were discussing prior to this video, which was political and geopolitical and economic reasons. These are the other factors, but unfortunately, religion is sometimes made the scapegoat, and is seen as an easy target to blame.
I think people in the video as well, some of them had recognized that as well, that it's part of human nature. One person mentioned that it's just wars are going to happen, and conflict is just part of our nature, as it were. And
another person mentioned a very interesting comment that if Muslims and Christians practice the teachings to the in the true spirit, then we wouldn't see conflict. Very, very interesting comment. That. And another lady also said that if being good news doesn't really sell.
Yes.
So that's again what we were discussing earlier.
Bad news is what gets into the media and influences people's views. So that's quite interesting. So just trying to move on to trying to get an idea of why certain teachings of Islam, for example, we say that the teachings are all about peace, but certainly over time it seems that the Muslims in general are interpreting it in a certain way, which seems to suggest that it's quite a violent religion. Why is it, do you think, that has happened?
I mean, again, Usman sir, referring to the video that was just played, one of the members of the public said that it's actually, religion itself, there's nothing wrong with it. It sometimes is the way the people practice it. And in the same way, it's the way that sometimes people start interpreting it. And that's, I think, the main issue here, is when people take it upon themselves to start interpreting religion and religious scripture and text. Right. You see, the Holy Quran in this regard is a very unique book, that the Holy Quran, very categorically states, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. That for you, in the example of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, is the best model, the best example. Every injunction of the Holy Quran has been beautifully and perfectly demonstrated by the lofty and noble actions of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. So the scripture that we have in the form of the Holy Quran, we have the noble practice of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, which has demonstrated that and put it into practice for us to see. Now there is no question of interpretation of how should one interpret it, or for some other groups to come about and say that it should be interpreted in this way or the other. And again, this links to the time that the Holy Prophet ﷺ himself had prophesied, that there will come a time, he had mentioned, which will be the decline of the Muslims. And these were the reasons why he said that the Muslims will be divided into so many sects, and each one will claim that his interpretation and his view of Islam is the correct one. And that is when he said that it would be the advent of the Messiah, of the latter days, the promised Messiah, which we believe is the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, has come in the person of Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian.
Right. And what is then the Islamic view on war and conflict? I mean, is it seen as a good thing, or is it bad? How does Islam see it?
Zafar Sahib mentioned this in quite detail, that the Holy Quran recognizes the human propensity for conflict. It has always been the case that if you take away religion, if you take away Islam, you will still see that wars would still have taken place. World War I, World War II still would have taken place. So when we know that conflict and violence has existed, and wars have taken place, and one group of people have carried out unjust and cruel acts on another, then at times a physical intervention is sometimes needed as a last resort, with the principle and the spirit of establishing peace.
Right.
Secondly, it sometimes is needed as a means of defense. If we look at the example of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, for 13 long years, he sustained relentless and merciless persecution at the hands of the non-believers of Mecca.
Right.
And after 13 years, after having migrated, they still wouldn't, they still came to Medina and still carried out that persecution.
So for those 13 years, there was no retaliation.
There was no retaliation whatsoever.
Despite being attacked so
And even
violently.
when the verse of the Holy Quran that Zafar Sahib quoted, in that it very clearly mentions that permission has been given because war has been waged upon you.
Right.
And then it says the reason for you to be able to defend yourself is not simply to just defend yourselves, but it's actually so that you can that the other places of worship and other religions can also practice their faith as well. So it's to establish the freedom of religion for everyone.
Right.
And that is why, as a last resort, as a last means, he gave. So these are the two reasons that we see. One, it's when one is acting unjustly, to intervene and to help them, and to only fight until peace has been established. And secondly, as a last resort, as a defensive measure. And this is something that we see even in the world today.
Yeah, I think everybody accepts that as a justified way of.
But the way then Islam and the Holy Prophet ﷺ has practiced that and shown that through his actions, we have seen that, as Hafiz mentioned as well, that he has exemplified that through his practice, that how he's always upheld justice and the establishment of peace has always been at the forefront in this regard as well.
And also, as Hafiz mentioned earlier, about how the treatment of people in war, I think that's quite important as well. It links in quite, well with the Geneva Convention and the rules of war around that you mentioned earlier as well. So, so that's very interesting. Now, the Muslim world, and perhaps Hafiz, you can address this, is that the Muslim world has been in a state of conflict, it seems, for the last 100 and so years, and there's a lot of emphasis on or focus on that, or at least it's noticeable that the Muslim world has not been at peace, it seems. Why do you think that is?
So you have a valid point there, and in fact, if I just see the news or see anything regarding the Middle East, one word that does come to mind is like turmoil. Because it's a very wretched and sorry state, unfortunately. But if we just go back a bit, as you mentioned, in the past 100 years, just go back into history and realize what happened in the Middle East, we will realize that, in actual fact, it has nothing to do with Islam. The deeper root cause of this problem was something completely different. If we look at Arabia and the Middle East area, it was all under the Ottoman Empire, just before the World War I. At the fall of the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany, so at the end of the war, that territory was, in fact, even during the war, the Western allies, Britain and France notably, in fact, had already organized and divided this plot of this area, the Middle East, as we know. And we can study in history, the Sykes-Picot Pact was formed. Straight after this, the Balfour Declaration, that was to do with Palestine and Israel, the new creation, the State of Israel. So we know that these have been the cause of tensions from the beginning. And in fact, we know now, when we study the archives, that Britain and France were heavily funding a tribal leader called Abdul Aziz bin Saud. And we know later on that he goes on to become the person who creates Saudi Arabia. And now they were essentially fueling a ideology of ultra-conservative form of Islam, which is based on the Wahhabi interpretation. And it's a very complete opposite of what the true teachings of Islam were. And a very, a violent form of Islam, if you can say. And that has penetrated to most of the countries we see. And as Shahzad Sahab alluded to earlier, the people that carry out these attacks, they study this version of Islam, as it's been promoted heavily as well, funded.
It had a lot to do with the whole petrodollar, the oil that they discovered, and they were able to spread this message as a result of that, bankroll it, essentially.
Essentially. And in fact, we see that that's what's taking place. Let's fast forward 100 years. If we study the fact that just before the invasion of Iraq, we, as a country, Britain, chose to go into Iraq and invade on the pretense of the precedent that there were weapons of mass destruction. Now we know in hindsight that there was no such thing. But the fact is, since our invasion of Iraq, there's been millions and millions of refugees. That power vacuum left by Saddam Hussein was filled by what we now know as ISIS. And it's one turmoil after the other. And it's not, in fact, the Muslims who are at fault here. We know in history, and I'm saying this as a historian from a side of studying history, that it has to do with the European powers or some certain powers who had vested interests in that region.
I think also there's a lot of the individuals who were leading those countries, also led them in a certain way which really, there was a lot of injustice conducted against their own people as well. Like, for example, in Egypt, for example, they really heavily persecuted the members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that basically led to them being radicalized. And then, you know, people like Sayyid Qutb, they came up with their very violent ideology that has also been taken up by a lot of the extremists of today. And so even that, the manner in which they behaved with their citizens, has led to a lot of the radicalization of people.
You're very right. And we're not condoning this, and we're not saying that Muslims had nothing to do with it. But what we're saying is that there's a bigger cause of this conflict that we see.
Yeah, it's not about religion.
It's not about religion.
Say there's a lot more going
on. From time immemorial, it's always been about resources. It's always been about who can get the most resources. Just go back to the slave trade, for example. Unfortunately, it was taking place. It was a horrific time in history.
Yes.
And what was the reason? It had nothing to do with religion.
Yeah.
It was all,
although they may have justified it at the time.
At the time they may have. But the whole fact is it's again, we mentioned, unfortunately, it's part of human nature, or part of when certain countries grow, they need to do these sorts of atrocities.
Right.
And you made reference to the pact. I think you said Sykes.
The Sykes-Picot
one. And someone made a very interesting comment and said that simply drawing straight lines with a ruler makes very complicated borders.
Exactly.
Because you completely are unfamiliar with the political, the ethnic, the cultural, the religious issues that are they just simply don't respond to those borders. And that was one of the reasons that fueled so much conflict. And then another unfortunate thing is that then the Middle East and whatever is happening in the Middle East is then equated to represent the teachings of Islam.
Right.
So what happens then, naturally people are viewing whatever, again, as we were talking about the media, whatever the media shows and it focuses on the Middle East is almost as if, in unsaid terms, is supposed to be that this is the teachings of Islam.
Yeah.
And then that's looking at it from a very historical perspective, but only recently the Arab Spring, this created a huge vacuum of power, which was simply just taken by terrorist organizations.
Yes.
And Hazrat Amir al-Mu'mineen Ayyadullah Ta'ala bin Aziz, in his lectures, in his addresses at peace conferences and other events, time and time again, mentioned this fact that where are these people getting their supplies from? These small terrorist organizations which are just established just within pockets in this land. Where are they getting their supply line from? Where are they getting their funding from? So there's a lot of other parties involved and other vested interests being fulfilled, and this is being used. And as I get the greatest injustice is that what happens in this land is attributed to the whole history of Islam and the teachings of the Quran.
I'd like to also just think a little bit about World War I and II, perhaps. I mean, those are two of the greatest wars that have taken place in the last century, known as the Great War. Even the First World War the First World War was known as. That was not caused by religion, right?
Absolutely, and Usman Sahib, it's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, and even World War III, God forbid, if that, whenever tensions rise and it makes headlines and we start hearing the word World War III, it's often the case that it's the friction between the US and North Korea and its allies.
Yes.
And again, His Holiness Hazrat Amir al-Mu'mineen Ayyadullah Ta'ala bin Aziz, the head of the MTA Muslim community, has mentioned this time and again as well, and said that these blocs and allies have already formed. And so again, if we look at this and study this, that a war that hasn't even broken out yet, but it has nothing to do with religion.
Right.
It's all, again, political, geopolitical and economic interests that are at the forefront.
Okay.
And they are the ones that are causing all of these, causing factors rather.
I'd like to get into a little bit about sectarianism as well. I think that's quite an important subject for us to address as well, because that is also seen as a key reason of why religion is blameworthy or deemed to be blameworthy for conflict. There's a lot of sectarianism that does exist, and we're seeing in Pakistan and other places, ISIS are quite adept at doing this as well, where they are using the fact that they are one type of Muslim against another and causing all sorts of mayhem. How does Islam see sectarianism?
Well, Usman Sahib, the Holy Prophet ﷺ, mentioned time and time again, and we find this in the Hadith and also in the Holy Quran as well, that the Muslims will always be strong when they are together as one community. And we have seen even prior to Islam as well, even in Christianity, when various denominations formed, it did lead to conflict and in some cases violence. And in the case with Islam, that has also been unfortunately the case as well. That, and again, we're referring to, it's not the religion and the teachings of the religion that are at fault, it's the people and the way they interpret and the way they practice it. And when these groups... Yes.
The Holy Quran also mentions that being divided into sects is a form of punishment as well from Allah. Is that correct? Where
yeah, I mean, punishment. Divine wrath comes from Allah the Almighty, and but as humans, we cannot distinguish as to which, what is here, who is being punished by God Almighty. But in one sense, the Holy Prophet ﷺ had prophesied the decline of the Muslims. And one of the reasons for this was for the forming of the sects. Right. That they were going to be where the Mosaic dispensation had divided into 72 sects, that Islam would be divided into 73. But the Holy Prophet ﷺ also gave a glad tiding with this as well. And he said that when this happens, there will be one sect which he's referred to as the Jamaat, as a community. And he said, and obviously he mentioned that this will be through the advent of the Messiah, who will then establish that community. And we, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, believe that the promised Messiah and the Imam Mahdi, who was prophesied by the Holy Prophet ﷺ, appeared in Qadian. His name is Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, and we, the Ahmadiyya community, are its followers. Right. And now after him, through the institution of Khilafat, we are growing, and inshallah, to unite the Muslims under one banner, under one leadership. And then, as we were talking about these difference of interpretations and sectarianism, that inshallah will be the end of it.
An issue that I've come across before is people raising against this idea of kafir and mu'min, a disbeliever and a believer. When we call someone to be a disbeliever, that's all, the allegation is that you are dehumanizing someone, and therefore it's a cause of conflict. How does Islam see these concepts, and why are they even there?
It's very true, actually, Usman, so you mentioned that. And even if we, in these days, if we study the words that we come across, in our day-to-day lives, like, expat, is seen as someone who's moved abroad, someone, so it's a positive term. On the opposite side, an immigrant, we know it's almost derogatory. As a negative connotation, and you're right. And in fact, we can see that if you start to use this sort of terminology, you automatically make a differentiation. You automatically ostracize that sect or that part of society, and that's a very dangerous route to go down. The Quran does mention this, and Usman, I think you were referring to this in very polite terms, but the Quran does mention it. In fact, the Quran mentions believers, it mentions mu'mineen, it mentions the disbelievers, the kuffar. Now, the Quran never mentions the kuffar in derogatory terms. It's to make a distinction. A kafir at the end of the day is someone who's disbelieved.
Who doesn't believe in the religion of
Islam.
Islam.
Doesn't believe in the religion of Islam, essentially. But if we look at study the life of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, when he was the ruler of Arabia, there were people living here who were disbelievers. There were people living under his rule who were Jews, Christians, of different religion. Yeah. And they all lived peacefully. And his dealing towards them was never derogatory. Even referring to the hypocrites who were staying with the Holy Prophet ﷺ, but they were, from the inside, had their devious plans. Yes. But the Holy Prophet ﷺ never called them hypocrites. Yes. He even stepped up to lead the funeral prayer of the chief of the hypocrites.
Right.
Everyone knew at the time as well, he's the chief of the hypocrites.
And the Holy Quran does refer to the hypocrites as practicing kufr.
Essentially, because that's what they were doing. But the point is, the Holy Prophet ﷺ even stepped up to lead his funeral.
Right, despite
Hazrat Umar's objections. But the fact that shows what the treatment of, again in history, it shows what the treatment of people living under Islamic rule should be, as compared to what we see today in the so-called Islamic countries.
Right.
For example, let's just talk about Pakistan. Yeah. We know that the blasphemy laws have no place in the Quran. There's no foundation that you can say that this is why there's a blasphemy law.
Right.
the hudud ordinance is the same. There's no basis in theology and no basis in the practice of the Holy Prophet ﷺ where they could say that we have implemented this on that basis. But that's what's shown in the world.
Yeah.
That because it's a Muslim, so-called Muslim country, that's what is ascribed to Islam. So again, that's another issue that we face these days as well.
Right. Right.
Sorry, if I may just add, is that if you read the entire text of the Holy Quran, then you will realize that Allah the Almighty, the injunctions and the teachings can be put into sort of two broader branches. One is the rights that you owe to Allah the Almighty, and the rights that you owe to fellow mankind. And the way Allah the Almighty establishes your relationship with Him, and the means that He provides by doing so, establish such a perfect relationship with Him, then naturally one will never show any ill intent towards His creation. It's like the famous saying that if you love the artist, you will naturally love his art.
Yes.
And the way, if you read the whole entire text of the Holy Quran, if you follow the example of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, as I've mentioned as well, you will find that then the natural consequence of that is that you then will have such a strong bond and relationship with mankind, which Islam takes you to the ultimate stage, which is known as the Ita'iz al-Qurba, that you treat others as if you are like kindred, as if a mother treats her child.
Right. That's what
I mean. The most
Islam
basic,
is trying to achieve.
The most
with
basic stage
right?
is which is known as adl. So if Zafar Sahib does something good to me, I return that good.
Yeah.
And then the next stage is ihsan, which is that without him doing any good or whatever good he does, I return it, but twofold or many times more. But then Islam takes you to the ultimate stage, which is Ita'iz al-Qurba, that regardless of him doing any good to me, just like a mother cares for her child, it's unconditional love. That is the love that Islam wants us to express. But that cannot happen without having a relationship with God. Because when you have a relationship with God and a strong bond with God, then naturally you will then love His creation.
Then
so that's what
it can't be a cause of
that
conflict.
is what the teachings of the Quran say. And so even though it may refer to people as kuffar and as mu'mineen, as Muslims, we have put no distinction in the way we treat others. And that's why you'll see the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is at the forefront in this, in terms of the humanitarian aid that we provide, the services that we provide for fellow mankind, and all the charitable works that we do.
Right. We've had one tweet in as well during the course of this show from a Sadia K, and she says that religion is just used as an excuse for most conflicts, while the underlying motivators are nearly always injustice, greed, and or egos, which I think it quite aptly sums up the real reasons for the conflict. It's not religion per se. Some stats I did come across regarding secular countries and how they are, if they are more peaceful than religious countries as such. And it was quite interesting. I found this, that the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, they gather some stats about, in 2016, who were the highest military spenders. And the United States were at the top of the list. $611 billion they spent in 2016 on the military. And I was also interested in seeing that in the top 7 countries, the 5 permanent members who are in charge of the Security Council, who are responsible for the security of the world, they spend just under $1 trillion on their militaries. So those are secular nations that are doing this. So thank you very much for your insights, Imam Shahzad Sahib and Imam Zafar Malik Sahib. I think it was quite a very, very interesting discussion, and thank you again for making time and sharing with us. And thank you for tuning in and engaging in the discussion. Today we have spoken about whether or not religion is the cause of conflict. I hope that you found the show interesting and beneficial, and please keep sending us your comments and feedback on our Twitter handle, which is @beacon_MTA, or our email address, which is beacon@mta.tv. Join us again next week at the same time on Beacon of Truth. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you.
इस्लाम कुछ भी हो जाएंगे हम जहाँ भी के जाना पड़े हमें, जाएंगे हम जहाँ भी के जा